if America is to withdraw wholesale from Europe, then Europe will have no choice but to coordinate in some manner or in a kind of NATO structure that doesn't involve the US.
Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, has arrived in Saudi Arabia ahead of talks with Russian officials. How quickly is this process going to move? Is it going to hit the roadblock of needing to involve Ukrainians at some point, or is it inherently possible that America and Russia can kind of sew this up between them and wait for the world to click into place?
Well, I think it's obvious from what they've both said that that's what they want to do, what they intend to do. There has been some grudging admittance that Ukraine would need to be part of this. I mean, you can't absolutely force Ukraine to act in a you can make it very difficult for them and you can put a lot of pressure on them, but you ultimately can't force them without military action of your own, to take on an arrangement that you haven't permitted them to be part of. I mean, I think we saw very clearly there that Zelensky in Munich appealed to Europe and appealed to them to essentially take Ukraine's side if the US is not willing to stand by it, and to become involved in Ukraine's security. So I think at the moment the Ukrainians are just fighting very hard to get their voices heard and to be part of that negotiation so that they can have some influence over it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I was speaking earlier this morning to Josh Glancy, and we were talking about how there's two parts of what's going on at the moment. One is the fact, what looks like the sort of looming surrender of Ukrainian territory to Russia, going back to the territory they took in 2014. But the other is this sort of American suggestion that once that's all been done, Europe is going to be on its own in standing against any future Russian threat. Keir Starmer is joining European leaders in Paris this morning to talk about all that and more. How do you reckon that's going to be going? What are their options? What kind of thing are they likely to put together? What chance is there of like a European army, an EU army, an agreed European peacekeeping force, all that kind of stuff?
I mean, isn't it ironic, Hugo, that in the lead up to the Brexit vote, we used to hear about this all the time, about this threatened European army that Britain would be forced into. And, of course, it was not true at the time, and Britain would always have had a veto over that. Now, Donald Trump is himself a great supporter of Brexit, is actually telling the Europeans that that's what they need to do. And so is Zelensky, because this is the reality, that if America is to withdraw wholesale from Europe, then Europe will have no choice but to coordinate in some manner or in a kind of NATO structure that doesn't involve the US. I mean, I personally, it grates on me that Europe did not see this coming and have not had these conversations already. I mean, I remember conversations, a year ago with the likelihood of Trump returning to power looming and speaking to European officials and saying, what are you going to do about this? And I think that there was willful blindness about this and disbelief that it could really happen. People saying things like, well, it's quite difficult to withdraw from NATO, and the US, they would have to go through Congress and all of that. But as I think Donald Trump and his administration have proved through the last few days and in Munich, you don't have to formally withdraw from NATO in order to abandon your European allies.
Spending aside, what is the status of European armed forces generally? I mean, Britain obviously spends a lot of money on the armed forces. We're a nuclear power, but our army itself is minuscule. France is a nuclear power as well. I mean, if there was some kind of European peacekeeping force, where are the troops going to be coming from? Who's likely to make up the numbers?
I mean, that's a really great question, because the people who kind of feel most strongly about European security and feel most threatened are the Baltic states, and they are also, and Poland, and they are the ones that spend the most on their military, predominantly because they know what it's like to be occupied by Russia. And so they have, pretty, they take it much more seriously. But they would be very well in their rights to say that their troops are needed to protect their own borders. I mean, with Donald Trump signaling pretty firmly that he's not going to come to Europe's defense, what is there to stop Putin, launching some kind of aggression against a NATO member state? safe in the conviction that Article 5 will not be invoked. So yeah, those are the people with all the troops, but they will need them themselves. They will have to come from Western Europe. They will have to come from Britain, some of them. Britain and France are the two nuclear powers, so I think any future structure will have to be led by those two. Germany did up its spending on defense in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but again does not have as many boots on the ground, as many soldiers in its forces as really are needed by this sudden wake-up call. So, I mean, I think we could be looking at some kind of force that involves also Ukrainians on the ground who will hopefully, in the event of a ceasefire, no longer be involved in active conflict, and so would be able to perhaps form something of a frontline force with Western Europeans behind them. But, I mean, this is all happening at the most dizzying pace. I mean, nobody really knows any of these things because it just, it's one thing after another. Suddenly this process is happening in Saudi Arabia, and Europe is absolutely on the back foot and scrambling to weigh up all these considerations at warp speed.
Well, look, we've just heard Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has been speaking this morning. Just moments ago, and he's pointed out that territorial concessions to what is now called Ukraine, these are his words, were made by the Soviet leadership during the formation of the USSR. So I guess he's basically saying that Ukraine owes them some territory, which is a neat development there. We'll come back to that in a moment, Catherine. The idea of the UK sending peacekeeping troops to Ukraine, and Keir Starmer has said this morning pretty openly, he's been writing a column in the Daily Telegraph where he says directly that that's what would happen. Again, I mean, how would that look? Because that's basically British troops on the front line facing down Russian troops. That's going to be a constant process of sort of near disaster and harrying and harassment and sort of brinksmanship, isn't it?
Well, it depends what form that mission takes. I mean, if it is literally a peacekeeping mission and there is a ceasefire, then it might behoove the Russians to, act peaceably in that, and for there not to be any actual, contact along that line. Don't forget the Russian interest in this is to call a ceasefire simply so they can rebuild their forces. So I don't know why they would bother to expend in the short term any more weapons, ammunition, or personnel along that front. It's Russia's interests to regroup. So in that sense, a peacekeeping mission in which there is, there's minimal hostilities, that could suit Russia, and it could go all very well for a few years. But I think that what everyone is concerned about, Donald Trump doesn't seem to take this seriously at all, but everyone in Europe and certainly in Ukraine firmly believes that Russia will exploit any cessation of hostilities or pause in hostilities to regroup and come back, just the way it did in 2022 when Russian troops attempted to march on Kyiv.
Yeah, I mean, the Americans seem to be the only people who don't believe that. That is absolutely inevitable. There's also been some idea floated in recent days, I think from Trump himself, that Ukraine should hand over some rare earth minerals to the US. What do we know about that?
Yeah, well, that was a deal that first came from Zelensky. I mean, I think he quite cleverly thought he was appealing to Trump's transactional, materialistic, acquisitional version of foreign policy. And so when he went in September to the US with this victory plan to present both to the Biden administration and to Trump himself in the, expectation that he may well be back in the White House, as indeed he is. So it came from this side. The Americans ran with that and drew up their own document, which was brought to Kyiv last week by the US Treasury Secretary. When the Ukrainians got to see that draft, they were stunned to discover that it wasn't a trade of mineral rights to the exploitation of minerals in Ukraine in exchange for future security guarantees. It was literally a bill for services and monies rendered thus far. So it was a payback for everything that the Biden administration has already given in support to Ukraine. So in fact, that as it stands, that collapsed in Munich. Zelensky told the Americans that no, that wasn't an agreement they could sign up to. And I have to say, I wrote about this over the weekend, that in fact it's much more complicated than it looks to sign over that kind of those kind of resources, because it's embedded in the constitution of Ukraine that those resources, the Ukrainian subsoil, belongs to the Ukrainian people and future generations. So there are legal complexities, as well as the fact that really there was nothing in it for Ukraine for the future.
I mean, isn't there also, I suppose, the prospect that if you've effectively got American firms mining in Ukraine, perhaps defended by America, I mean, that does discourage Russian forces from taking the territory where they actually are. Do we know what areas of Ukraine we're even talking about here?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends what you're after. It seemed from the document that Trump was after anything he could possibly get his hands on, including oil and gas, which is really are not financially viable at the level he's talking about. But he was talking in particular about rare earth metals, which are used in technology, 50% of which are in territory that's currently controlled by Russia.
Wow.
He's also talking about lithium, titanium. There are deposits of those in central Ukraine, but only last month the Russians took territory near Pokrovsk, which contained the largest lithium deposit in Europe. So, I mean, there is some urgency to this if you actually want to get hold of those deposits. But something that speaking to experts on the geological experts and strategic experts on this too, they warned, even if you're talking about places in central Ukraine, for example, around Kryvyi Rih, which is Zelensky's hometown, which is a mining town. No commercial company is going to sink in, the amount of money and investment into an area that still has Russian missiles raining down on it. It's not just the movement of the front line that makes it dangerous. So, I mean, and there will not be, American troops here. So there has been some suggestion from the Trump administration that a civilian American presence to exploit those minerals might be enough to keep out the Russians. But these are areas of the country that are being hit all the time by ballistic missiles, by drones.
Wow. Look, you're obviously in Ukraine at the moment. You're in Kyiv, and you've been reporting from Bucha. People remember was the site of a horrifying massacre by Russian forces earlier in the war that shocked the world. What did you find out? How are people there reacting to what's going on at the moment?
It's really interesting to go back there now, because I was actually quite surprised by how unwilling now people are to talk about it. I think that there's obviously a collective trauma that to live in a place whose name is associated with some of the worst war crimes that have happened, certainly in the early part of the war. But the people I did speak to who wanted to speak about it, I mean, they are very concerned that their search for justice, their attempts to, have the war crimes committed, they're prosecuted, are now imperiled by this agreement, and that there will be pressure on them to drop that. And, it's something we see in many conflicts, is this balance between peace and justice, that if you strike a peace, especially an unfavorable one, which this is increasingly looking like, what happens to justice, and will you ever manage to catch the people responsible? Now, I also saw the war crimes prosecutor for Ukraine on Friday, and he told me that the only person they'd caught who was implicated in the massacres in Bucha, they caught him in occupied territory in Kherson as the Russians were retreating. They grabbed him and found out afterwards who they'd got. So it's really only when Ukraine recovers these areas that you have any likelihood of catching the perpetrators. And the other issue, of course, that they're looking into is what's going on in these areas that are occupied now and that may be handed over permanently to Russia, because those are where some of the most egregious crimes are going on right now.
Blimey, yeah, indeed. Look, once all this is, I'm going to say settled, it's never really going to be settled, but once all this sort of dies down a bit, where do you think Donald Trump's going to turn next? Is his focus going to be Taiwan? Is it going to be Iran? What do you think is next from the sort of the rolling chaos of this administration in geopolitical terms?
Mm. Well, look, I think it's fairly clear that, we are looking at this. We keep calling it transactional, but I think it's almost materialistic or acquisitive. We have, from the very first days of the administration, heard about this rather unexpected kind of neo-imperialist bent to the presidency, where Trump would like to take back the Panama Canal. He'd like Greenland, talks about, Canada becoming the 51st state. Obviously, there's a lot still to be worked out in the Middle East, although he has expressed how little he wants the US to get caught up in that. He did signal that he would like to reopen nuclear talks with Iran, which is rather surprising in some ways, because he trashed the deal that Obama had done and undid that. That means now, of course, that although Iran is very weakened by what's happened in the Middle East in the last 6 months or so, they are still closer to a nuclear bomb than they've ever been. So, that is something that may take up some bandwidth. I think in the case of Taiwan, I think the Taiwanese are just watching what's happening with in Ukraine with horror and wondering what it means for them. That, does Donald Trump want to do some kind of deal with China, and would he come to their defense? Because it doesn't look much like it right now. So I think we have to sort of, in order to predict where Trump might be going next, is to think like him and think, what might he get out of it for his own sake, or for the bottom line.
Thank you very much indeed, Catherine Philp. Catherine is, of course, the Times' World Affairs editor. Always good to speak to you, Catherine.